Welcome in to In Touch with Indiana Sports, a Wednesday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden with you as always. Welcome to the middle of the week. For some of you, maybe your week's already over because it is indeed the day before Thanksgiving. I know depending on what your workplace is, some people are already out for the remainder of the week. And if you are somebody who that affects, then shout out to you on your short week. Most people get a short week as well. I just know that some places, whether it be if you're a teacher at a school or, whatever other job it may be, some people are already off. And if you fit into that category, congratulations to you on your extra day of relaxation and hopefully some thankfulness along the way, right? And again, happy early Thanksgiving. Maybe some of you are listening to this on Thanksgiving Day. If you are, I hate to tell you, you're going to be listening to a lot of information that is probably a little irrelevant at this point because we're going to be doing a lot of previewing for the battle for Atlantis. And some of you may realize that this episode has been published a little earlier than normal, and that is because Indiana basketball takes on Louisville at noon today. And I needed to make sure that today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports got released as early as it could so that the information that is shared in this episode is, it stays fresh for as long as possible. Because once the game tips off, then all of our chatter about Indiana versus Louisville specifically kind of becomes irrelevant. And speaking of that, a good friend of mine, a colleague of mine from iHeartMedia in Louisville, is going to join me for today's episode here in a little bit to talk a little bit of Indiana versus Louisville. Mr. Nick Coffey, very happy to have him guest on the show today. And he provides a ton of good information on what to expect from the Louisville Cardinals as Indiana prepares to take on Louisville and Pat Kelsey's team in the first round of the battle for Atlantis. Man, I'm excited for this. I'm excited to finally kind of get into basketball mode, right? Because as many of you who follow along with this show regularly, hopefully there's many of you who follow along regularly. And if you do, I'm very grateful to have you. And if you're a first timer, I appreciate you as well. Hopefully you'll give me a fighting chance to win you over today. But for those of you who have been following along, you know that it's been difficult for me to fully get into college basketball mode just because there's been so much good coming from the Indiana football side of things. Normally by this time of year, especially this week specifically, we talk a little Old Oak and Bucket, but this time we have that on top of college football playoff rankings. Is Indiana going to make the playoff? What do they need to do to make sure they get in? This is something that we never thought would be conceivable at the beginning of this season. And it is indeed something that we are going to continue to talk about for a little bit today as well. We'll save the college football playoff rankings reaction until the end of the show. But I will give you my thoughts on where the Hoosiers landed in this most recent edition of the college football playoff rankings. And if it looks like I'm uncomfortable, it is. I don't know if it's because of the way I'm sitting. I don't know if I need to take a deep breath, take a drink of water. I guess we'll try a little bit of all of those things. Because one thing, for those of you who are familiar with the show, I don't like to reset things. There was one show back towards the inception of In Touch with Indiana Sports, maybe in its second or third week, where I recorded myself. I re-recorded the intro, the first couple of minutes of the show, maybe 7 or 8 times. And I remember I was like, this is not something I want to do regularly. So I'm trying to get comfortable, and I definitely am a lot more comfortable with kind of the pauses, trying to readjust myself whenever I find myself getting in, whether it be an uncomfortable posture or that type of thing. But I don't want to sit here and talk about it too much because I know none of you are here to listen to that nonsense. You want to hear thoughts on the Hoosiers. Maybe you care about my thoughts on the Hoosiers. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just need to hear somebody talking in your ear as you make your way towards your Thanksgiving destination, whatever that may be. And if you chose me to do that, maybe your options are pretty slim. Who knows? But what we're going to do today, again, I already mentioned, we'll talk a little Indiana versus Louisville. I'll save most of that for the conversation that I have with Nick Coffey. And but what I'm also going to do here in just a moment, I want to give a little bit of a profile on each of the teams that Indiana could potentially face down in the Bahamas over the next few days. Of course, they'll play this afternoon. They'll play tomorrow on Thanksgiving Day, and the time of that game is to be determined. If they win, they will play once again at noon, and if they lose, they'll play, I believe, at 2:30. And then the game 3, that could be a whole different amount of times depending on what happens in games 1 and 2. But we all know they're facing Louisville in game 1. In game 2, they will face the winner or the loser of West Virginia and Gonzaga. And then game 3 could be one of 4 teams between Arizona, Providence, Oklahoma, and the G5 team in this tournament, the Davidson Wildcats out of the Atlantic 10. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to give a quick profile. And again, it's going to be very brief. I'm not going to do a deep dive onto each of these teams, but I want to share what their record is, who their leading scorer is, and maybe if I have any additional thoughts on things I may know about each of these teams. And we'll start with Louisville. And again, we will do a deep dive into the Louisville Cardinals with Nick Coffey here in a moment, or after we get through some of these. But Louisville has started their season 3-1 with wins over Morehead State, Bellarmine, and Winthrop. And they have a loss to number 12, Tennessee. They lost that game by 22 points. And, of course, common opponent right there. Indiana faced Tennessee in exhibition play, went on the road, and defeated the Volunteers 66-62. But since that loss, and even though that loss didn't count, Tennessee, they're on a tear. And, of course, Indiana won't face Tennessee in the regular season. But and I don't know how much stock to put into a win in an exhibition scenario like that. And it was on the road, but that win, though it didn't count, looks really good for Indiana right now. And it's unfortunate that it didn't count. Moving on to Gonzaga. Gonzaga currently 5-0. They have a win over number 8 Baylor. If you remember, that was one of the opening games of the college basketball season, one of the marquee opening games of the season. They defeated Baylor 101-63. Huge win. Followed that up with a win against Arizona State, UMass Lowell, San Diego State on the road, and then Long Beach State. Pretty much every single one of those games were blowouts. Only one of those games was a win by less than double figures. And I just realized I didn't mention Louisville's leading scorer, so I'll go back to that in just a moment. But Gonzaga's current leading scorer is Graham Ike with 14.6 points per game. I hope I said his last name right. I know it could be EK or something like that. You never know. But Louisville, their current leading scorer is Rain Smith, averaging 14.8 points per game. Little quick note on him. He is one of Pat Kelsey's transfers from College of Charleston, where he came from. A little tidbit on him. Moving on, though, to the West Virginia Mountaineers. They're currently sitting with a 3-1 record with wins over Robert Morris, UMass, and Iona. They suffered a loss in their third game on the road to the Pittsburgh Panthers, 86-62. I feel like many people believe that West Virginia is one of the weaker teams in this edition of the Battle for Atlantis. Again, when you're playing this early in the year, sometimes it's hard to really tell, especially, and we'll get into this in a little bit. If you look at what's going on in the Maui Invitational right now, that tournament has been absolutely bonkers. And we'll save some of that for after our segment with Nick Coffey, because what's going on in Maui is, the Maui Invitational is always a fun tournament to watch. Really, all these MTEs are, especially for Feast Week. And don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we will talk more about that in a little bit. But West Virginia, their leading scorer is Javon Small, averaging 15.5 points per game. Moving on to the Arizona Wildcats, currently ranked number 24. And while I'm talking about rankings, I didn't mention Gonzaga currently ranked number 3 in the country. Arizona ranked number 24. They are 2-2 on the year with wins over Canisius and Old Dominion. And they've already faced 2 marquee opponents, which is pretty rare for any team at this point in the season. They lost both of these games, one of them on the road at Wisconsin. They lost 103-88, and then they hosted number 12 Duke, lost to them 69-55. So Arizona, not off to the best start, but they've also played a much more difficult schedule. I would assume more than likely the most difficult schedule when it comes to teams that are a part of this battle for Atlantis. Arizona's current leading scorer is Jaden Bradley at 15.5 points per game. Moving on now to the Big East's Providence Friars, currently sitting at 5-0 with wins over Central Connecticut, Stonehill, Hampton, Green Bay, and Delaware State. And I think it is safe to say that, again, I haven't even looked at Oklahoma or Davidson yet, but this is without a doubt the cupcakiest schedule of the teams that are participating in the battle for Atlantis. Central Connecticut, one of the worst low majors historically, at least from what I can recall. Stonehill, this is only their second year playing Division I basketball, I believe. I say that, and I feel like when I say those things and they come out of my mouth, I'm just asking for somebody to correct me on that. But I'm almost positive that this is only their second year at the Division I level. Hampton, not a big program. Green Bay, also not a good program. Delaware State, I feel like they covered on the road in football against Hawaii in week 0. And I remember that being a big talking point when we were talking college football. Again, has nothing to do with their basketball program, but just what I think of when I think of Delaware State. Providence's current leading scorer is Bensley Joseph, averaging 11.8 points per game. I don't know much about him other than that. So there's that. The Oklahoma Sooners, now part of the SEC, no longer in the Big 12. They currently sit at 4-0 with wins over Lindenwood, Northwestern State, Stetson, and East Texas A&M. That's right, not Texas A&M, East Texas A&M. And I sat there and said Providence may have had the cupcakiest schedule. I mean, this is up there in that as well. And those two teams will face off against each other, by the way, in the first round, Providence and Oklahoma. So it'll be a battle of the unbeaten cupcake winners between Oklahoma and Providence. Providence's leading scorer is Jalen Moore at 18.8 points per game. And we will move on to our final team in the field of the battle for Atlantis, the Davidson Wildcats out of the Atlantic 10. They are 4-0 with wins over William Peace. Not a Division I team. I want to make that clear real quick. Bowling Green, Eastern Tennessee State, and VMI. I know I sat there and I kept thinking that each schedule I was going over was the weaker one. And it seems like really all three of the last teams I just went over could have had some of the easiest of the schedules. And of course, none are going to be more difficult than what Arizona's had to do so far to this point in the season. But Davidson sitting at 4-0. Their leading scorer is Reed Bailey, averaging 19 points per game. And they will face off against Arizona in their opening round. A battle-tested Arizona, I might add. So there's some quick profiles on each of the teams that Indiana could potentially be facing in the battle for Atlantis. And of course, we know they'll face Louisville to tip things off, and then they'll face the winner or loser of Gonzaga and West Virginia. And if you're Indiana, of course, you hope that you put yourself in a position to face Gonzaga. Of course, that's just assuming that Gonzaga defeats West Virginia. You want to beat Louisville no matter what, but ideally you put yourself, and Gonzaga puts themselves in a situation to where you're facing off against each other in the second round, because when you look at that other side of the bracket that includes Arizona, Providence, Oklahoma, and Davidson, not that any of those teams are bad, and you would probably more than likely want to face an Arizona team between those four. But at the same time, maybe that Arizona win wouldn't mean as much considering they've already taken two losses on the season. Now, they're still probably a decent team. It's just a very interesting situation that they find themselves in, having already played a couple of marquee level opponents. So that's very interesting to think about. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and we'll transition into our segment with Nick Coffey, do a bit of a deep dive into the Louisville Cardinals, Indiana's first opponent in the battle for Atlantis, tipping off today at noon. And I'm very excited to introduce Mr. Nick Coffey to my listeners here at In Touch with you. I say that as if I'm not talking to you right now, to you guys, the listeners of In Touch with Indiana Sports. So without further ado, Mr. Nick Coffey. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce a friend of mine, a colleague. He is the host of Coffey and Company on Sports Talk 790 in Louisville, Kentucky. It is the one, the only Nick Coffey. I am proud to have you on today for an episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, my friend.
You could not be happier than I am to be here. So looking forward to it. It's been one hell of a run for your Indiana Hoosiers in football. Not something that I or really anybody probably saw coming. And now you got basketball. So good vibes for the Hoosiers, and looking forward to this matchup with the Cards and the Hoosiers on Wednesday.
Yeah, very excited. They're going to tip off. They're going to get things rolling for the Battle for Atlantis on ESPN tomorrow at noon, or I guess when this comes out, it'll be today at noon. And it's sure to be a heck of a matchup. Last time these two teams met, of course, it was last year in Madison Square Garden for, I don't remember what the name of the MTE was at the time, but a totally...
or the Jimmy V something. It was one of those two. It was
it was one of those, or maybe it was the Legends Classic. They have a bunch of different ones that they play up there in Madison Square Garden, but either way, Hoosiers, Cardinals, second year in a row. But this is going to be a totally different Louisville team than what Indiana played against last year against Kenny Payne. You now have Pat Kelsey as the head coach, an entirely revamped roster full of guys, even one that Indiana fans will be familiar with Chucky Hepburn. And Louisville's off to a 3-1 start on their, with in Pat Kelsey's first season. Just go ahead and kind of give Indiana fans just what should they expect initially from this Pat Kelsey-led team?
I would expect you will see them attempt to dictate pace, style of play. I mean, everybody wants to get into a style that fits them where they can have the highest ceiling. For Louisville, that is fast. They want to get as many possessions in as possible. They're going to have most guys on the floor, no matter who's in, and if it's a starting player or a guy coming off the bench, really whatever the rotation is, there's going to be many guys that have the green light to fire from three. And everybody on the team that Pat Kelsey brought in, which, by the way, brand new team. I mean, there's not a single player that was here a year ago, as you mentioned. So every one of them, outside of maybe one or two, actually one because the others is injured. But one of the things that made them attractive to Pat Kelsey in the portal, as well as any other school coming after them, is they can shoot the ball. Now, I'm not sure how many of them are elite shooters. There's a couple of guys that I feel like if they get open, they can get hot in a hurry. That's Terrence Edwards Jr., the transfer from James Madison, was Sunbelt Player of the Year last year. And obviously Rain Smith, who followed Pat Kelsey to Louisville from Charleston. So, if Louisville's going to be at their best really against anybody in any situation, early season, late season, it'll likely be because they're a really good three-point shooting team that really hasn't clicked just yet as far as percentages go, but they're going to want to go fast. They're going to try to force turnovers. They're going to gamble defensively, hopefully not too much, but they'll risk it defensively if it can, in fact, speed the game up and potentially give them a chance to create some points off turnovers. That's something that, against much weaker competition, they've been able to do. When they haven't been great from the three-point line, they've been able to make up for that by creating a lot of opportunities to get buckets off of turnovers their opponents are forced into. So going into, I believe, their last game, it may have changed since then, but they were number one in the country at forcing turnovers. Now, that's a little misleading, although the majority of the teams they've played have been kind of to the same level of the teams Indiana's played outside of maybe South Carolina. So lower level competition, but even in the game against Tennessee that Louisville did not do well in, they still were able to force the balls into a lot of turnovers, which was pretty uncharacteristic. So for Louisville, they're going to want to go fast. They're going to fire up a lot of threes. They don't have a lot of physicality in the post. I don't mean to say that they're soft. They just don't really have that physical presence like Indiana has when it comes to Umar Ballo. I mean, that's just, to be honest, there's probably not many teams that have a guy with that kind of presence in the paint. But as far as, what should Indiana expect when it comes to this guy or that guy, it's still kind of a work in progress to figure out who is going to be somebody that is super important in games like this against really good teams like Indiana. So I'm kind of hoping to get an answer to the question as well whenever you see this team challenged again. Against Tennessee, there really wasn't any player that I feel like was I mean, I don't want to act as if that was just an all-time, embarrassment. It wasn't a good game, and it could have gotten uglier than it actually was, a 22-point loss. But as far as personnel, when it comes to players that Indiana needs to be ready for, I mean, I could give you 6 or 7 of them, but, it's not because they've got that many guys that are just, something you have to account for and you're going to be worried about. It's all brand new. This is only the second time we'll see Louisville play somebody that is going to challenge them the way that Tennessee and Indiana do.
You've talked a lot on your show about kind of not really knowing who's going to end up being the go-to guy for Louisville. And I think you kind of just laid out a little bit of what I'm about to ask you anyway, is like, is there anybody that you feel like is emerging from this kind of, I don't want to say lovable misfit roster, but just it's a bunch of pieces that have been, I don't want to say forced together either, but it's a bunch of pieces that have come together under a brand new head coach. And you're kind of figuring out how things are going to work in this early portion of the season. Who do you think so far for Louisville has, at least in some way, shape, or form, separated themselves as somebody that's probably going to be relied on a little more heavily than others?
It was a humongous question mark in that Tennessee game. And since then, they've had 2 games. They played Bellarmine and Winthrop. And I would say it was encouraging to see Chucky Hepburn show that he can be an offensive option for you, a guy that can initiate not only for his teammates, but he also has the ability to score himself. Cason Pryor is probably your most talented player, a guy that really can be a mismatch problem because he's every bit of 6'10", good athlete, and can shoot it. Just a natural scorer, a guy that really excels in transition. But I'm not sure if he's the guy that you say, okay, let's just give him the ball here and go get a bucket. I mean, typically you would do that with a guard, a guy that can really create. Cason can create some, but he's not as much of a perimeter player. I mean, I think if you're talking about a 6'10" guy that you say, okay, we're going to play through him. We got one chance here. Let's feed the post. Let's get him in a mismatch. Let's do a pick and roll. It would be a guy who is more of a back to the basket 6'10" player. That's not Cason Pryor. He just is not, he's not built like that. He's more of a hybrid big. And where he can create problems as a 6'10" player is with what he can do on the perimeter. So, I mean, I think Chucky Hepburn is probably the best option because I trust him a little bit more as far as just making a play in crunch time. But I'm basing that off of just hope. There's really been no instance where I've seen it. It's just, I know he's been in a lot of close games in the Big Ten, and I know he's a good player too. I think Terrence Edwards Jr. is somebody that if you asked other folks in my position would probably mention him as well, and I have no issue with that. It's just, you know, he was so shaky in that Tennessee game, and it kind of felt like he was believed to be the guy that would emerge, and he probably had the worst game of his young Louisville career, and it was against a really good team, so maybe he just had an off night. I know he's able to score in bunches. He's a guy that'll have, 0 points at halftime, finish with 13 in the second half rather quietly. So, they've got options. They've got guys who have that ability to potentially, go score and really not need it to be based off of, a fast break bucket or just a transition 3. It's just at this point, being able to do it against teams of this caliber that Indiana is, it's just, I mean, I'm hoping somebody emerges to where you say, okay, we know we're going to be in many tough games the rest of this tournament. They're going to be a lot more tough games just in December for Louisville with their non-conference schedule. The Bahamas, this trip in the battle for Atlantis is where you got to figure out, okay, when you're in this spot against these kind of teams, you can't just expect to win based off of a style that you're going to play. You're going to need some dudes to dig deep, make plays, get stops, and just kind of, get the best of their opponent. And that's easier said than done. But I think for me, it would be Chucky Hepburn, Terrence Edwards Jr., and Cason Pryor. I feel like that's going to probably be the core of this team. Maybe Corin Johnson. He's the reigning Pac-12 Sixth Man of the Year. I guess he'll be the last Pac-12 Sixth Man of the Year ever, considering the league's no longer around. He's out for probably a month or so, so he won't be, he won't be available in the Bahamas. So I would say if it's going to be the most likelihood of somebody kind of emerging as the guy for Louisville, it would be Cason Pryor, Terrence Edwards Jr., or Chucky Hepburn, really in no particular order.
I know you haven't seen Indiana play as much, or at least haven't watched it as closely as you've watched Louisville, but from what you know about Louisville and what you know about Indiana, and maybe even what I've told you about Indiana, what do you think Louisville has the ability to do to potentially expose Indiana in a game like this?
It's a good question. As far as exposing them, I don't really know I would say right now, Indiana's weakness from what I perceive is that they kind of play to the level of their competition. They start at times a little sloppy, but usually they're able to turn it on and put together a big run to where they'll go on a run that'll essentially just eliminate a team. I mean, teams like SIUE, I know Eastern Illinois, I think it might have been the game where near halftime, that game was rather close. Indiana won 90-55. So, I think if there's maybe a chance Louisville could take advantage of something Indiana has shown for the first 4 games that maybe gives them a better chance to win this game, it would be maybe hoping that they're sleepwalking. And I don't mean that jokingly.
No,
I mean,
that's something that Indiana's had issues with so far this season, especially really every game except South Carolina. There's been moments where they get lazy defensively. They're not rebounding very well. They let teams go on a run. And as I don't want to call Louisville a streaky team just yet, just because I don't really know if there's enough evidence to really say that that's part of their identity.
Who knows what to call Louisville right now, right? It's just so brand new, and you've only really got one game that you feel like you can take anything from.
But with the brand of basketball that they play, and you mentioned this the other day too, both Indiana and Louisville like to run up and down the floor. I just think the way that they attack things on offense is 2 totally different things. Indiana under Mike Woodson is always going to be paint first, perimeter second, and I do think they have a more complementary perimeter game this year as opposed to years past. Whereas Pat Kelsey, he rarely uses his 5 in the traditional sense, to where he's out there, he's on the perimeter himself sometimes, maybe not shooting threes every time he gets the ball in his hand, but Louisville more than likely will be looking for the 3-pointer more often than most teams would be in those scenarios.
Yeah, and that's not only is that the way Pat, I mean, last year Charleston was either second or third in the country in 3-point field goals made and 3-point field goals attempted. So that's just what he wants to do. And he was able to go out and build a team that, you know, their ceiling is going to be really high if they're able to get into what they want, meaning decent looks, a lot of possessions. And if this team's shooting 40% from 3 and they're taking a lot of them, that's a really good recipe. Now, they haven't done that just yet, but you're right. Indiana, I think, has the personnel. Well, they'll run with you. I mean, and they've got the ability to do it, but also in the half court, it's a totally different world because Louisville doesn't really run a whole lot of sets, which I don't love, but that's just the way they play. They run some things here and there. And in the half court, I think they've clearly realized after the Tennessee game, they're going to have to implement some things, some kind of action in the half court to generate a decent look. Because if you're just passing it around like a hot potato, expecting, you know, one of your guys to just be able to take his man to the bucket or just go get a free throw, it's tough to do when you play really good defensive teams. And Louisville learned that against Tennessee. So in the half court, you know, they're still trying to figure it out. But you're right. They're not going to. They just don't, even if they had it, it's not what they want to do, but they don't have a post presence where they can feed it and just kind of, and it would really make the world of a difference, to be honest with you. That's the one area that they weren't able to really shore up in the portal. But as far as Indiana, look, they're going to run. I mean, Coach Woodson gets criticized, or he was criticized. I'm not sure if it's still a thing, about how he said, I believe on his coach's show at one point last year, that you can still feed the paint. You can still run your offense with your bigs being a big part of what you do. And it was like he said something that was going to get him canceled. I mean, I know that's not modern basketball. And to be honest, the modern way is more so, and I hate referring it to that, but that's what it is. I mean, that's what Pat Kelsey, that's what Mark Pope, that's what those guys are. And Nate Oates, they're analytically driven. They play what is called modern basketball, where they're going to space it out, a lot of possessions, a lot of threes. You want to either get to the free throw line or the rim or get a good look from 3. That is the principles of what you're trying to do offensively. With Mike Woodson, they can play through a big. Not to say that you're going to run everything through Ballo, but that's clearly somebody that if he gets the ball in the block, one, good luck keeping him from getting to the rim. He's so big, but also it's going to, I mean, the rest of the defense is going to have to account for that. Do they send a double team? I mean, that depends on if he's going to work or not, and he's causing a lot of problems. But I've always felt pretty good about Indiana's half-court offense. And at times, you know, when it's not working, it can look really, really bad. When you're not playing fast and you're in the half court and you've got some empty possessions, you know, fans lose their mind as if, you know, what the hell are they doing out there? What's their strategy? And I get it, but sometimes that actually works. I mean, I think Indiana has really good balance on this roster to where there's really not an area, whether it be their front court, their wings, or just, you know, the bigs, to where you could say, okay, that's an area we can go exploit. I mean, last year they had a good roster for the most part. They just weren't as solid in the backcourt. And so far, it seems like they've really tightened that up with the addition of Miles Rice, Kanan Carlisle. I mean, I like Indiana's roster a lot. As you mentioned, I've talked about that a lot on my show. I think when it comes to pieces and personnel, Mike Woodson has put himself in a spot to where if this team is not one of the better teams in the Big Ten, if they're not looking like they've got a pretty good seed for the NCAA tournament, I think Indiana fans would be understandably frustrated and feel like he's not getting it done to the level that he needs to, because from the roster, not to say they're perfect, they're going to lose games, and certainly there are teams probably better than them, but there's a lot to like. I think Louisville's going to have a really tough matchup here against this Indiana team.
Before I let you go, and I'm not necessarily asking for a score prediction or anything like that, but is there any way that you see this game playing out today?
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the Louisville side, it's just again, this is a terrible answer because it's
It
not
might
really
have been a
much.
terrible question,
Well,
so
no,
it's my fault.
it's not. I have a better feel for Indiana, I feel, than I do Louisville, and maybe that's just because I'm, more worried about like Indiana has guys that, whether it be at Indiana or elsewhere, they've kind of shown what they can do, who they are. They've established, an identity in college basketball. You know what you got to account for. With Louisville, they for Indiana to be on their heels because of something Louisville did, I would assume it's because Louisville was able to get them playing that pace, and Indiana would get a bucket here and there, and it looked like they were thriving in this pace, and then all of a sudden Louisville hits 3 threes, and it's a game changer to where they've established somewhat of a lead. But I just, I think if this is a slow down, grinded out game, it's going to be a bad result for Louisville. But maybe I'm wrong. Again, Louisville's such a question mark right now. It's been said for a while when it comes to this Louisville team, you're really going to learn where you stand after you get back from the Bahamas, because just the way the schedule's set up. I would imagine they've made some improvements against Tennessee since the Tennessee game, but we'll find out later whenever these two teams play. But I said it on my show, I don't expect Louisville to win this game. I think Indiana is going to be the deserving favorite. But, if it's competitive, moral victories aren't something that we really like around here when it comes to Louisville. But, let's be honest, Louisville won 4 games 2 years ago, 8 games last year. So if they're competitive against Indiana, I would see that as progress. But mostly it's because I think Indiana actually has a chance to be a really, really, and I think they should be a really, really good team. But I think Indiana will win, and I believe it'll be competitive. But
I do as well.
We'll have to see.
We will see. And I tell you what, it is going to be interesting to see over the course of the season what this Louisville team ends up looking like. Because there are really, them and Kentucky's Mark Pope's Kentucky team, both very interesting case studies of brand new head coaches bringing in entirely different rosters. And I don't know if there's any other set of program in the country that are doing that type of experiment this season. So it'll be fun to see for sure.
Yep. I would say that, with Louisville so far, and again, they've played 4 or 5 games. So the case study for me is going to be, is it more beneficial to go get guys who specifically fit what you want to do? Meaning, all right, this guy, he fits, I can put him in a spot here to where he can be my guard that runs the floor, gets open. He's good enough. He's not as much of a liability defensively, and he's a shooter. Or do you need to, at this level, when you play teams like Indiana and Tennessee and all the other teams they're going to play, do you more so focus on, okay, I'm not really sure exactly how I'd use him, but I know I could use him, and I know he's really talented. And I think Louisville has talent on this team, but I just think it was a real wake-up call when they went out there against Tennessee and Indiana, in my opinion. I mean, obviously, Tennessee's off to a phenomenal start, but I think from a personnel standpoint, like individual players, I think Indiana's roster is better. So, to be honest with you, I'm a little bit worried about what happens later, but, we'll see.
He is the one, the only Nick Coffey. If you live in the Kentuckiana area, you can listen to him on weekdays, 3 to 6 on Sports Talk 790. And I appreciate you taking a little bit of time to chat on my show today.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to what is hopefully a good game. Appreciate you, John.
Big thanks to Nick Coffey for taking a few minutes to come on and share his insight on Louisville as Indiana gets prepared to take on the Cardinals here this afternoon. Really excited to have him. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Nick is somebody I've gotten really close with at work over the last couple of years, working on his show in the afternoons. And I'm sure many of you, I've told you already, I'm no longer working in that time slot. But hopefully one day we will team up once again in some other way, shape, or form. But one of the best dudes ever when it comes to radio personalities that anyone can meet. So shout out to Nick Coffey. And I would say good luck to the Cardinals today, but I don't want I already know what's going to happen if Indiana doesn't find a way to beat Louisville today. And I laid this out the other day, I believe, or at least I know I chatted about this with somebody. But even though I think this is a pretty good Louisville team that Indiana's facing, we all know what's kind of at stake for the Hoosiers today. And I know that I feel like I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my head right now, if that's even a phrase. Both sides of my mouth. Is that how it goes? If Indiana wins today, it's definitely a good step in the right direction, of course, because you want to get off on the right foot, really against your first decent competition. And you could say that South Carolina was your first decent competition. And that is true to an extent. You faced a Power 4 opponent, but I mean, South Carolina may very well be the worst team in the SEC. Maybe that's an exaggeration. But based on some of the early returns from them, especially their loss to North Florida, it wouldn't surprise me to see Lamont Paris's squad struggle this year in the SEC. So with this being your first true, your next step up in competition, and with kind of the warm seat that Mike Woodson currently has, and some would say it's warmer than just warm. Some would say it's fairly hot, and you would probably have a good argument with that or for that, if that makes sense. But with Indiana facing Louisville today, a startup Louisville team that's kind of an experiment, as you guys heard Nick and I talking about. I mean, you got a first-year head coach. I mean, first year at a power program like Louisville. He's been a head coach for a long time at Charleston and then Winthrop before that. But when you're bringing in somebody like that and he's got a brand new roster it's kind of similar, for being honest, to what Curt Cignetti did with Indiana. He didn't bring in his entire team from JMU, or from Charleston, I should say. But he did bring in a bunch of guys, and he's trying to make it work with this system that he has. And it's a very unique modern system. And here's one thing that I'm not looking forward to potentially happening if Indiana does lose. And it's just people pointing out, oh, it's the style of basketball that's the reason they lost. And then again, I'm jumping way ahead of myself. I shouldn't even probably be talking about that right now, because we have to wait and see how this game's going to play out. Because I do still think that with the correct personnel, which I believe Indiana has this year, you can run the style of offense that Woodson wants to do effectively, which is where you have a bunch of complementary guards on the perimeter to give an extra boost to what you have going on down low. So hopefully, I think this will actually be a really good game to see how well that works in general, just because with the lack of size on Louisville's team, I think this will be a really good opportunity for Oumar Ballo to kind of have a breakout game. And hopefully he's charged up his motor a little bit, because one of the early issues we've seen with Ballo is that sometimes he doesn't always put forth the best effort. And hopefully we see him do that this afternoon when they take on Louisville. Because if he has a bad game, that's probably not a good sign for what happens with the overall result of the game. So I'm excited. And again, it's big for just pushing yourself forward into expectations, not only for this tournament, but for the rest of the season. You don't want to, here's what would happen. I guess this is initially what I was getting into, since I kept veering off in different directions. The narrative around this game, if Indiana loses to Louisville, is going to be, well, Mike Woodson's clearly not working out. If a first-year head coach like Pat Kelsey can get things done against a team that's kind of struggled the last year and a half in some way, shape, or form, Indiana needs to do something more like that. They need to play a modern style of basketball. And that may be correct. We don't know yet. But to jump to that conclusion that quickly is also something I would hesitate to do. I'm hoping we don't have to have that conversation at all. Because if they win, then that narrative can at least get thrown out the door temporarily, right? And then you'll move on to play likely a top 3 team. Well, not that I say likely you'll play this team, but they are a top 3 team. That's Gonzaga. You'll move on to face them. A chance for one of the biggest wins so far in the college basketball season. And if you do that, then you're really rolling. You can really start to raise the ceiling for what this Indiana basketball team can likely be if you defeat a Gonzaga team that is, if they're really as good as their ranking shows they are right now. And then what happens in the championship game, if you win that, then again, getting way too ahead of myself. We're just doing a lot of speculating at this point, right? So I'm excited and looking forward to seeing what happens on the floor this afternoon. Hopefully it's all good things to talk about, because Indiana basketball needs to experience the same level of joy that the Indiana football program has gotten to experience this year. Now, what does that look like? Again, because the expectations around the Indiana basketball program have always been significantly higher than the football program. But at the same time, football has nearly reached the level that Indiana basketball wants to always be at, which is competing at the championship level. And I know Indiana is likely not, now that we've seen them face Ohio State, they're likely not a national championship caliber team, but they're still in that tier just below that. And if you're Indiana basketball, I feel like you always want to be in that same ballpark year in and year out. So yeah, I think that'll probably do it for Battle for Atlantis stuff. But here, there's so much other college basketball going on right now, and this is what's historically known as Feast Week, right? On ESPN, that's what they've labeled as. I don't even know if they call it that anymore. But it's the week where there's all these multi-team events going on. Obviously, the Battle for Atlantis, Maui Invitational. I've got a list right here of the different ones going on this week. There's the new Players Era Thanksgiving Festival, where I believe the winning team gets a big pot of NIL money or something like that. I don't know the logistics of that. The one thing I do know about it is that Creighton, who is participating in this tournament, originally was going to be in the Battle for Atlantis in place of Providence. But once whoever put together this Players Era tournament decided they wanted who they wanted, Creighton backed out of the Battle for Atlantis and decided to play in this event instead. But you got that, you got Maui, you got, of course, Atlantis, the ESPN Events Invitational going on, the Rady Children's Invitational. I'm not familiar with that one. There may be a new one, but Purdue is playing in that event along with NC State, BYU, and Ole Miss. You got the Arizona Tip-Off, the Acrisure Invitational, and the Acrisure Classic. I'm not too sure what the difference is between those two. There's different teams. I'm trying to see if they play in different venues. It looks like they might be. But I guess the same sponsor for two different tournaments. And then the Fort Myers Tip-Off. And that's just to name a few. I think there may even be several other lower level tournaments going on. I know later on, I believe this might be a Christmas time tournament. There's the Diamond Head Classic that also takes place, I believe, in Hawaii. So yeah, but one thing I want to talk about here before we get into the college football playoff rankings is what in the world has been going on in the Maui Invitational. And for those who, some of you probably already know where I'm going with this, and that's what is going on with UConn, man. Back-to-back reigning national champion UConn Huskies have dropped their first two games in the Maui Invitational. First one being to Memphis in overtime, to Penny Hardaway's team. And then yesterday, or last night, I should say, giving up a double-digit lead to Colorado to lose your second straight game. And on top of that, legendary head coach, now I think we can say that comfortably, Danny Hurley, recently offered, or over the offseason offered to become the Lakers head coach. He's having meltdowns on the floor. He's going to his post-game press conference and blaming officials for things. And I didn't watch the entirety of either of those games. So I'm not going to sit here and try to act like the officials were one way or another, that type of thing. But it's just very surprising to see somebody who has become kind of the new face of college basketball head coaches, right? Whenever so many of the legendary names, Mike Krzyzewski, Roy Williams, guys of that caliber are retiring, for the last several years, we've been looking for somebody else to step into that upper echelon of, who's going to be, the big name when it comes to college basketball head coaches. And after his second national championship last year, Dan Hurley absolutely fit that bill. He was being thrown around for all the major jobs, specifically the Kentucky job. And then, as I mentioned, he was offered the Lakers position and turned it down to remain at UConn. And just to see him act the way that he's acting, it's interesting. And I know you're disappointed with things going the way they're going, I'm sure, down in Maui, but I would just expect somebody like him to be a little more self-reflective, right? And I'm not trying to tell him how he should act. Maybe it's coming off that way. It's just surprising to me that someone like him is reacting this way. Okay. That's what I want to make my point clear. You act however you want. I mean, there is a line that you shouldn't cross. But I'm just very surprised that he's taken the route of, I mean, there were people who had to push him back in the second game against Colorado from, going out on the floor. I believe there were some technicals given in both of those games. And just interesting, some of the other results going on in Maui, I'm going to go over those. Michigan State defeated Colorado in the first round, 72-56. Auburn defeated Iowa State by 2, 83-81 in the first round. North Carolina defeated Dayton, 92-90. And then the Tuesday scores, I already mentioned Colorado defeating UConn. And, full disclosure, many of you know this, I'm recording this on Tuesday night. So, a lot of these scores technically haven't happened yet. Thankfully, the UConn one already has. I'm trying to see if the Michigan State score has already happened. Though they're current. So as I'm recording this right now, Michigan State is at half with Memphis. It's 34-31. But by the time this show comes out, of course, the rest of the second round games will have already occurred. But I saw Matt Jones from Kentucky Sports Radio mention that UConn might be the best 7th place team ever in the history of the Maui Invitational. And maybe that's true, but you know what else might be true is UConn maybe not as good this year. And not that they can't rebound from a couple of losses like this. I mean, the Maui Invitational, some people think it can be kind of a death sentence, right, for your season if you don't come out of this in a good way. It can really kind of pummel your record a little bit early on if you lose it. I mean, we've seen Indiana struggle in the Maui Invitational. I believe they got 7th place one year, if I'm not mistaken. And honestly, you could say Indiana's, the battle for Atlantis, it does have some high caliber opponents in it, but usually the Maui Invitational is the end all be all when it comes to the premier multi-team events during the non-conference part of the season. But the same does reign true. You don't want to lay a couple of eggs in, especially for Indiana specifically, where your non-conference schedule and making the most of it is kind of relying on doing well here. I would say anything less than 2-1 would be considered a disappointment. And some may even think 2-1 is a disappointment, depending on who that loss comes to. Like if you lose to Louisville and then you go on to beat, West Virginia in the second game, and then follow that up with, really anybody from the other side that's not Arizona, Providence, Oklahoma, or Davidson, it don't even matter. Some people may say 2-1 in that scenario is a disappointment. I don't think I would go that far. It would be disappointing that you wouldn't get to beat a better team, and maybe those teams end up being really good. Who knows? But many people think it's 3-0 or bust for this Indiana team, or at least 2-1 with a loss to a Gonzaga, maybe in that type of scenario. But we'll see. It is very important for Indiana to. I saw Zach Osterman put something out the other day last night, I should say, that Indiana doesn't have to be at its absolute very best this week, but where they are currently right now, it has to be the best version of that. Does that make sense? So you don't have to be playing your best basketball of the season right now. In fact, it would probably not be good if this was your peak, right? Like if you were playing your best and you didn't get any better, that would be a problem. But whatever the best version of Indiana at this current point of the season is, that's where they need to be this week as they go through each of their games here in the Bahamas. So very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see how things play out, of course. And I'm looking forward to taking it all in this afternoon and the rest of the day's going ahead. We got some football, of course, to take in as well. I've got a Thanksgiving football parlay I'll share at the end of the show for those who are interested. But for now, let's go and get into the updated college football playoff rankings, shall we? So in the latest edition of the college football playoff rankings, Indiana comes in at number 10, falling down 5 spots from their previous ranking at number 5. But due to auto bids and some shifting around that takes place because of those bids, they would be the 11 seed, making them go on the road for their first round of the college football playoff. So first of all, their ranking. I think number 10 is very fair after the events that took place in Columbus this past Saturday. And it would have been a whole lot worse had there not been all of the carnage that took place in the SEC over the weekend, with Ole Miss losing, with Alabama losing, with Texas A&M losing. Really, things could not have gone much more in Indiana's favor after all of that took place. So it seems, based on all of that, on the new ranking and what they have left in front of them, that if they take care of Purdue and take care of them handily, I don't think Indiana fans should have any reason to question that they would get into the college football playoff. Now, would I guarantee it? I mean, there's crazy things that could happen. I mean, if there's some upsets with teams that are right behind, a couple spots behind you in the playoff rankings, like if South Carolina defeats Clemson, or even Clemson, I mean, they're both kind of right there. If both of them beat each other, I mean, maybe you would see them jumping Indiana. Now, would that kick them out of the playoff? Heck, maybe it would, right? Because right now, the way that it stands, with them being the 10th ranked team, but the 11th seed, that means if they were the 11th ranked team, would that put them out with Arizona State being the auto bid from the Big 12? I don't have the exact rankings. Let me see if they've been updated at the moment of me recording this on here. I know that I began recording this section of the show immediately after I saw them reveal the bracket, and it doesn't look like they've put the updated poll on their site. I don't remember off the top of my head who the so never mind. Number 12 is Boise State, meaning they move up to the 4, because Arizona State, being unranked, they move into that 12 spot when Boise State moves up to the 4. It's still kind of confusing to figure out, but here's what the bracket looks like for Indiana in this current position. If this were the final college football playoff rankings and Indiana were the 11 seed, they would go on the road to number 6 Penn State in Happy Valley. And while maybe it's not super fun to play a team in your conference in the college football playoff in the opening round, I think Indiana matches up pretty well with Penn State. And plus, you'd have a fun storyline that involves Tom Allen getting to play his former team in the playoff of all things. And you likely have a very cold afternoon or evening in University Park, Pennsylvania, when these two play, if this were to be how it things shake up. And then if you pass that test, I happen to think that between the 4 teams that you could potentially go on to face in this matchup, or in the 4 teams that have the byes, Oregon, Texas, Miami, and Boise State, the 2 that are the ones you would want to play are, of course, Miami and Boise State if you get past your opening round matchup. And Indiana, being the 11 seed, if they won, they would go on to play Miami in the second round, which that would more than likely be a very offensive slugfest, and it would probably come down to whichever team made the least amount of mistakes, I would assume, in that type of game. And that would be really fun to see. And I would love to, if we get to that type of matchup down the road, would love to hear what Mitchell thinks would go down in that, because again, that's his worlds colliding, his childhood fandom, and of course the team that he played for in college with the Hoosiers. So other matchups in the updated college football playoff bracket: number 8 Georgia versus number 9 Tennessee. Again, another SEC matchup, again like the Big Ten has with Indiana, Penn State. You've got Notre Dame and SMU in the 7-10. And you've got number 5 Ohio State versus the number 12 Arizona State team. So, interestingly enough, I feel like the path Indiana has currently, as opposed to if they were one ranking higher, is more favorable for them than if they were in the other spot, because SMU jumped Indiana in this most recent edition of the playoff rankings, and they will have to travel to a very hot Notre Dame team. And of course, going on, if they win, they'd have to play against a very, I would say, battle-tested Texas team, but they don't really, they're kind of similar to Indiana, where they don't have a super significant win to speak of on their schedule. And they will get a chance to beat a decent Texas A&M team this weekend. But I feel like Indiana, if you have the choice, no matter what the ranking, like the number next to your team name is, if your path is Penn State and Miami versus Notre Dame and Texas, I think you're the more favorable chance for you to move on from those two games is the one that they're currently in. So I wouldn't be disappointed. I also wouldn't mind seeing Indiana travel up to play Notre Dame just for kind of the novelty of that. You'd have a team that is, historically known in the state of Indiana with Notre Dame, and a team that is more known for its basketball, of course, the Hoosiers. I hate, that is what gets brought up all the time, but it is the case, and it's what would be talked about if that matchup happened. But I'd love to see Indiana stick it to Notre Dame up in South Bend if they get the opportunity to do so. So hopefully Indiana can just do what they need to do, take care of business, leave, just like Ryan Day said whenever Ohio State and Indiana were about to play this past Saturday, leave no doubt, right? I don't know if that's exactly how he phrased it, but that's what Indiana needs to do against Purdue this weekend. Like I keep in my head saying beat them 56-0. That's 2 touchdowns per quarter. And I don't think that has to be the exact score for Indiana to call a success. But I think that would be something to aspire to do if you're Indiana. And maybe that's cocky of me to say, but let's be honest. This Purdue team is bad, and they're more than bad. This is without a doubt the worst Purdue football team that I remember since the Darrell Hazel era. And on those Darrell Hazel teams were very bad as well, most of them. So Indiana just needs to take care of business. Don't give the committee any reason to think that if a team behind you has a good weekend, that they should leapfrog over you and potentially knock you out of the college football playoff. Hopefully that does not end up being the case. I think if they handle business, then things will be A-okay for the Hoosiers. So that's my thoughts on the updated college football playoff rankings and how Indiana fits into those rankings. And one more thing I mentioned that I would share before we wrap up today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, my Thanksgiving Day parlay. It involves, it's an NFL parlay, of course. And I was going to do some spreads when I put this together, but the more I thought about it, I'm like, you know what? Let's just keep it simple and pick 3 winners for Thanksgiving Day. And I've gone with the Lions over the Bears, the Giants over the Cowboys, and the Dolphins over the Packers. 2 of those are underdogs, the Dolphins and the Giants being the underdogs in their matchups. And the Lions are heavy favorites over the Chicago Bears. So Lions money line, Giants money line, and Dolphins money line for Thanksgiving if you want to tail me on the In Touch with Indiana Sports Thanksgiving Day parlay. And until Friday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Check out everything going on the website, especially for updates going on with the Battle for Atlantis. And until Friday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.